It's music not on Monday. It's Tuesday.
Da 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 da.
Today I have information about the origins of rock and roll music. As you know, I am a huge fan of rock and roll. All of this information has come from my History of Rock and Roll class textbook, written by my professor, John Costa. So rock and roll, in its very beginnings, was a huge mix of blues and boogie-woogie, like all the awesome piano stuff, and honky-tonk, and country, and R&B, which is a mix of jazz and blues. It was solely African-American music. This time period, which is late 1940s, early 1950s, there was a music gap. And this gap was teen music. And rock and roll was able to fill this gap. So on one side, you had adult music, which was Tin Pan Alley. Some Tin Pan Alley artists were like George and Ira Gershwin, Frank Sinatra, and Peggy Lee. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you had children's music, which was from TV and movies and things like that. Basically, it was just Disney. The reason why there was a teenage gap was the rise of teenage consumerism. And this was because of the baby boom, flight to suburbia, and post-war prosperity. So starting with R&B, Louis Jordan was the father of R&B. So the blueprint, if you will, of Louis Jordan's kind of R&B was that there was less instruments than you would have in a big band jazz group. It was a really good mix of jazz and blues, and also he made it really humorous and fun. He had really funny lyrics, he would tell stories, he would make jokes, that sort of thing. So this guy named Alan Freed, he was a DJ, and I think later he became a producer, but don't quote me on that. Alan Freed was the first to call R&B music rock and roll. And from then on until Elvis came into the picture, rock and roll was always associated with R&B. In the textbook, there's what's called the three cradles of rock and roll. This just means that there was three really major cities in the development of rock and roll. These three cities were New Orleans, Memphis, and Chicago. First was New Orleans. From New Orleans, we've got Fats Domino and Little Richard. Little Richard could kind of be classified as your first rock star. He was pretty wild. He had a lot of gospel influences, so he had some like crazy vocals, and he would dance and be crazy on stage a lot. In Memphis, we have Elvis. There's so much I could tell you about Elvis, but I think he'll have to be his own episode of this. And in Chicago, where we had the beginnings of Chicago Electric Blues, we had Bo Diddley and Chuck Berry. Chicago Blues is really cool because they are the start of the electric sound. What happened was they would be playing these acoustic instruments with these really crowded, packed clubs, and you just couldn't hear anything because it was just so loud with so many people. So they figured out how to hook their guitars up to an amp, and thus the electric blues were born. And that's basically all the important stuff about the first era of rock and roll. How it ended is another interesting story. There was many different things that happened to a lot of the major artists of rock and roll at this time. For example, Elvis was drafted, and Little Richard went off and became a priest. He stopped doing secular music. Chuck Berry was arrested for transporting a prostitute, and he wasn't released until the British music invasion happened, which made it pretty much impossible for any American artist to really make it anywhere. And then get this, Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper were all killed in the same plane crash. Sounds like a conspiracy. So there was, again, a huge vacuum. Teen pop music took over. It was basically the opposite of the gritty, hard-edged sound of rock and roll that everybody had come to love. Instead, it had a sweet and contained sound. One huge thing I want to mention about this era, which is true for everybody up until the Beatles about, you couldn't produce any music unless you had signed on with a record company and had a producer. And basically what this meant was that your record company and your producer, and they all had songwriters, and you didn't do any of the writing at all. You were just the performer. And that's crazy to me because nowadays so much music is made solely by the artists. Look at DFTBA Records and Hank Green and Charlie McDonald with Chameleon Circuit and Alex Day and so many others just over YouTube. They write and produce and record and everything all on their own. Anyway, thanks for listening to all that. It was pretty fun for me, and I'm glad I got to share some of my knowledge. I don't know how to end a video.